computer. Yes, thank you. That was the other computer that I was trying to join from. Um, Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this edition of the West African Transitional Justice Center's Author Spotlight. My name is Iwa Lewa Olorigami. I am a research officer at the West African Transitional Justice Center, and I am also a doctoral student in anthropology at the University of South Carolina. I will be the moderator for this afternoon's conversation. So I would like to just start us off by just saying that the West African Justice Center is dedicated to research, training, and programming. And with events like this one, we are able to create a space for serious conversations, scholarly conversations, and accountability, memory, and justice. Our convener, Dr. Philip Olayoko, could not be here today, but he sends his warm regards. He's currently traveling to a conference. So today's spotlight is on the responses to Nazi perpetration in fiction, complicity and continuities, published by Bloomsbury Academic. And the central argument of the book, at least while I was reading it, was that fiction occupies this irreplaceable space for exploring perpetrations and complicity, especially when you're looking at, state-sanctioned mass violence. And I think one thing that Professor Bird really does well is that she doesn't resolve all these paradoxes. She keeps them open and calls our attention to the anxiety that is surrounding, giving perpetrators a voice, the fear of moral contamination. And I just thought it was interesting how the novels that she studies, uses this anxiety productively. And I thought that was interesting. So I'm going to go on to just introduce our author and our discussants, and then we'll get right into it. Okay. So first, our author is Professor Stephanie Bird. She's a professor of German studies. She holds a bachelor's from Oxford and a PhD from the University of Birmingham. And her work covers novels, narrative techniques, literary theory, ethics, and cultural treatments of history. Our first discussant is Professor Sue Weiss of the University of Sheffield, who has worked on the representation of the Holocaust for many, many years, both in teaching and in print. Her books include Holocaust fiction, a BFI volume on Landsman's Shore. Professor Weiss, welcome. Professor Bird, welcome. Finally, our discussant is Dr. Zoltan Kikesi, please. I apologize for my pronunciation, who is a research fellow at the Center for Collective Violence, Holocaust and Genocide. He's a cultural historian of Central and East Central Europe with a focus on memory studies, Jewish history, and Holocaust research. Dr. Kikesi, welcome. Thank you so much. So I will hand over to Professor Bird to start her presentation. Please let me know if you're unable to share your screen or anything. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to share my screen and hadn't. Right, first of all, can you hear me? Yeah, and second of all, can you see my shared screen?
Yes, we can provide that.
Fabulous, good. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in your program, your center's program. It's a great honor to be able to engage with you in discussion about these complex and troubling matters as perpetrator violence and complicity. What I want to do today is first give a sense of the book and the context and a bit of what I do in the book. And then I want to talk about precisely what you mentioned, my interest in the importance of fiction. And then finally, I want to talk about a text that wasn't actually part of this text focus, but led out of my research on the Nazi context, which is Tsitsi Dangarembga's This Mournable Body, as an example of how fiction explores complicity. So I'll start with the context of Nazi perpetration, the historiography, and how I treat it in the book. So since the Second World War, the issue of culpability with Nazi atrocities has been fiercely contested. The understanding of who might be considered complicit with persecution and mass murder has entailed fundamental shifts in how agency is conceived of. So from the 1950s in Germany and among German historians, there was widespread recourse to a victim narrative, with a small Nazi elite blamed for the evils that had been visited on the Germans. In their eyes, they were the main victims. In the 1950s and 1960s, the focus of the historiography on a discrete group of ideologically committed Nazis at the head of a totalitarian regime reinforced this narrative. And in parallel, historians in East Germany, in the GDR, worked with an ideological framework that reduced the culpability of workers and peasants by understanding Nazism as a product of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. So this is a slide from the online exhibition that colleagues and I curated as part of a project on complicity and perpetration, to give a sense of how the numbers of those involved in perpetrating violence can be differently understood. But interest in the relationship of the wider German population to the functioning of the Nazi regime grew from about the 1970s. And since then, historians have in different ways emphasized the changing interactions of individuals with the norms and structures within which they operate, and the extent to which actors' behavior both shaped and consolidated the norms and structures that facilitated persecution and mass murder. So even though non-Jewish Germans were subject to coercive measures, German historians have pointed to the way many of these Germans used Nazi ideology for their own ends, with the regime offering opportunities that allowed for individuals' self-empowerment, for example, getting slave laborers. And Harold Welzer points out the sobering irony that it was a dictatorial system that granted to many citizens an expansion of their personal freedom. So the Nazi example points towards the ways that dividing lines between the perpetration of state violence and complicity are hard to draw, except for a small ideologically driven vanguard and the few sadists who enjoy violence. People's involvement in violence exposes the complex and dynamic interplay of identity, social processes, and behavior, and the different, often conflicting ways in which individuals position themselves in relation to social formations and groups. The recognition of the complexity of the relations that the concept of complicity seeks to define has resulted in a broadening of the notion of complicity from its legal contexts into affirming complicity as a productive heuristic tool. So as such a tool, it opens inquiry into the many ways in which individuals and groups and their own self-understanding are situated within wider structures and social processes, how identities shift over time in relation to changing circumstances and norms, and how people, groups, and institutions justify themselves and normalize their behavior at the time and after. So it's with this understanding of complicity as a relational concept that I've approached the novels in the book. Looking at works by 8 authors, I consider how the novels contribute to our understanding of perpetration and complicity in mass violence more generally, taking the violence under National Socialism as the starting point. I analyse how authors construct and play with complex justificatory and post hoc exculpatory narratives to think about their own socio-political contexts. And finally, in the book, I explore how the novels interrogate their own constructions of mass violence and potential complicity in or resistance to violence, and inseparable from this self-reflexive dimension, what this means for the novel's address to and positioning of the reader. So in part one of the book, I focus on authors who can in different ways be understood as victims of dictatorship. Imre Kertész survived Auschwitz and the forced labor camp of Zeitz. Borislav Pekic was imprisoned for 5 years and interrogated by the Yugoslavian regime for his pro-democratic activities. And Alexander Tishma, whose mother was Jewish, saw himself as a bug who survived the bug spray. Their positions as writers who lived and worked under the post-war dictatorships of Hungary and Yugoslavia give them a perspective on dictatorships and the possibility of resistance that challenges notions of choice. In part two, I look at contemporary German writers who weren't involved in National Socialism, but who by virtue of being Germans might arguably be said to have benefited from a state whose post-war reconstruction involved a failure of justice. I consider how a text by Hans Magnus Enzensberger, depicted here, texts rather by Enzensberger, Volker Kutscher, and Merle Kröger, intervene in current discussions around social democracy, its legitimacy and its limits, and whether their interpretation of the past consolidate liberal democratic ideals in the present. And finally, in part three, I consider what it means to be ordinary and become complicit in violence or try to resist violence. I think about complicity in relation to global capitalism and globalized networks and questions about the possibility of counterpositions. Both Nir Baram here, the Israeli author, and Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish author, raise the question of whether resisting complicity must in turn involve ordinary people themselves in perpetrating violence. All of the works point to different types of troubling continuities, troubling because they almost all reinforce the proximity of violence. They suggest that individually and socially, the road to perpetrating violence isn't paved only with indifference, but with the types of structures, behaviors, and justifications that are considered normal, sometimes even admirable or desirable in non-violent situations. To understand perpetration and complicity under Nazism is to understand the ease with which state-sanctioned violence is executed and integrated as normal at all social levels, while at the same time the normality is disavowed through narratives that attribute responsibility to others. The various authors' interest in causality extends also to questioning institutional, social, and political continuities between National Socialist violence and regimes after that, different types of governance. The authors engage directly with institutional and cultural continuities across regimes, both in terms of personnel and in cultural attitudes that persist, particularly in anti-Semitic and anti-communist sentiment. These include the police, security services, the army, prison guards, engineers, marketing, academia, for example. And crucially, all the authors either explicitly or implicitly address the relationship of discursive and representational modes for understanding complicity and perpetration. So by mediating their concerns through fiction, the writers draw our attention to how fictional representations construct, reinforce, or challenge wider cultural discourses that enable and constrain a subject's behavior and her understanding of that behavior. It's undoubtedly an interest in the distinctiveness of fiction, its interpretative openness, and the nature of the ethical space it opens that underpins my analysis of the 8 different authors. So I'm interested, and I'm going to address now, questions of what fiction can offer that, say, history, anthropology, sociology, and so on, don't offer or might not offer in the same way. And it's to a discussion of fiction that I'll now turn. When Elizabeth Costello writes her statement of belief, she describes herself as a trader in fictions, and as such, someone who changes beliefs according to her needs. Costello is J.M. Coetzee's writer-protagonist in the book of the same name, a novel, and she is compelled to write this statement for a panel of judges who are evaluating whether she may pass through the gate into what appears to be paradise. She cites Czeslaw Milosz to describe herself as a secretary of the invisible, open to all voices, not just the voices of the murdered and violated. If it is their murderers and violators who choose to summon me instead, to use me and speak through me, I will not close my ears to them. I will not judge them. She will speak for murderers as long as they speak the truth. The judges are not happy and ask Costello whether she is bankrupt of conscience by not judging between a murderer and his victim. She's further irritated by their hackneyed questions about how she feels able to judge that truth. She tells them she neither has faith in art, nor do her books seek to teach anything. They merely spell out how one person lived, one among billions. Literature is unique in its ability to explore structures and processes of perpetration and complicity. Literary texts have long been interested in the complex motivations and emotional dispositions of characters and how they're situated within and respond to their social contexts. At the same time, literature frequently scrutinizes its own processes of representation and forms of mediation, and how these relate to systems of power and hegemonic discourses. The reader participates in linguistic and cultural constructions of identity, which may of course result in the naturalization of discourses that tolerate harms and affirmation of the political structures they support. Yet texts also solicit ways of reading that challenge or unsettle readers precisely by inviting them to assume perspectives that they would normally find emotionally and morally objectionable or repellent outside the boundaries of fiction. So there are many different aesthetic strategies for ensuring that the reader is drawn into ethically compromised situations, not least through the use of voice, mode of address, eliciting identification and other and intense emotions. And these strategies help undermine attempts by the reader to maintain a disinterested moral stance that would position her outside of the complex entanglements and naturalization of discourse about which she's reading. Indeed, they may also confront the reader with the question of her own enjoyment. For what does it mean if we find ourselves empathizing with a perpetrator or faced with an invisible admiration of the murder, the decisiveness and ruthlessness, the audacity? No. Or, as Coetzee asks of the writer who is preoccupied with state violence and torture, if the novelist finds in squalor the occasion for his most soaring poetic eloquence, might he not be guilty of seeking out his squalid subject matter for perversely literary reasons? Coetzee points to the fundamental problem faced by the writer of how to avoid either ignoring the state's obscenities or producing representations of them, a dilemma that also extends to readers. So literary texts have long solicited ways of reading that challenge or unsettle readers, precisely by inviting them to assume perspectives they would normally find emotionally or morally objectionable. There are many different, okay, I've already, okay, hang on. So coming back, that was indeed a quotation. Sorry, I got my text in a mess there. So what does it mean if we find ourselves empathizing with a perpetrator or faced with an invisible admiration of the murder, the decisiveness and ruthlessness, the audacity, an admiration that the narrator of Yishai Sarid's novel, The Memory Monster, sees in the Israeli children for whom he acts as a guide through the death camps. Perhaps it is in the seduction of the perpetrator that we make visible the little perpetrator in each one of us, to use the phrase of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Like Elizabeth Costello, Jorge Luis Borges resists moralizing about voicing perpetrator perspectives. He is unapologetic about letting Otto Dietrich zur Linde speak as the Platonic idea of a Nazi in his fictional monologue Deutsches Requiem. Borges insists on the separation of his political beliefs from his fiction. I think a writer's duty is to be a writer. Everyone knows my opinions, but as for my dreams and my stories, they should be allowed their full freedom. George Steiner, too, defends his freedom as a writer to have his fictional Hitler speak freely in his own defense in his 1981 novel, The Portage of San Cristobal of A.H., letting him point to the complicity of other nations in the Holocaust and the fact that his crimes were exceeded by the crimes of others. Steiner was criticized for putting in Hitler's mouth provocations and dialectical arguments, either unanswered or indeed in some degree unanswerable. In response, Steiner argues that his fictional Hitler's questions are valid and unavoidable, but that he has no answers. Indeed, Steiner says of himself that he has grown to distrust those who confidently and eloquently do have answers, for the many examples of mass murder present us with unthinkable paradoxes. Okay, so in work that has developed out of my thinking of complicity in relation to the National Socialist context, I'd like to turn now to the Zimbabwean writer Tsitsi Dangarembga. In a very different context from Nazism, Dangarembga explores the theme of complicity through an individual who perpetrates violence and is herself also a victim of violence. As she says in interview, it's important to realize that being complicit creeps up on you. However, the creep of complicity isn't that of a predator approaching its innocent prey, as her metaphor might suggest, but she explains or emphasizes the way in which complicity arises out of the interconnection between the individual and society. You cannot be who you are outside of the context that you are living in. So this Mournable Body is the final novel in the trilogy that follows the life of Tambudzai Sigalka from colonial Rhodesia through to Zimbabwe in the 1990s. The first two novels are retrospectively narrated by Tambu in the first person. In Nervous Conditions of 1988, she recounts her education at the mission school run by her uncle and the growing distance she feels from the impoverished life of her mother's homestead. In the Book of Not, 2006, she tells of her experience at one of the country's elite girls' school, where she's one of a handful of black girls, the 3 to 5% of black pupils allowed to attend the so-called multiracial school. Her elite education is an integral part of the state-sanctioned racism in Rhodesia of the time and takes place against the background of the Zimbabwean War of Liberation, or Second Chimurenga, from 1964 to 1979. In this Mournable Body, now in the 1990s, Tambu is embittered by disappointment and failure, angry and jealous of those doing better than her, but still ruthlessly determined to succeed. She's acutely aware of her age and is consumed with self-loathing, feeling deep shame at her inability to provide for her family. The novel's title rebuts the consensus about mournable bodies that Teju Cole decries in his article Unmournable Bodies in the New Yorker in 2015. This consensus values some deaths more than others, with little grief expended on, for example, those killed in Mexico, Gaza, or the Central African Republic. A critique of such racializing hierarchies is central to Dangarembga's trilogy, but assumes quite remarkable form in this mournable body. The novel focuses on the harm done to Tambu by racism, patriarchy, and aggressively expanding globalized capitalism. What makes it such a fascinating novel is that Dangarembga explores those harms through a figure who is resentful, angry, often violent, and who is wedded to the values of financial success and social status. What's particularly interesting from a literary point of view is the author's choice to write it in the present tense and in the second person singular. Well, could be plural. That's one of the ambiguities. Dangarembga points to the importance of the second person for drawing in the reader, binding the reader through a duty to listen, bringing the type of intimacy that occurs when an individual unburdens herself to another and slips into the you. An I narrative, she explains, would enable the reader to disengage from a character who is frequently unpleasant and abusive despite her anguish. So we're dealing here with an intimate form of empathy. I'd like to give as an example a passage in which Tambu's potential for violence is described. She's overwhelmed with envy at the sight of her younger hostel mate's beauty. She feels empowered and energized by the crowd's hostile response to Gertrude's revealing clothes and the verbal and physical abuse people start inflicting upon her as she tries to get into a combi minibus. Tambu is prevented from throwing the stone and participating in violent assault only because a combi driver intervenes to save Gertrude. In a later episode, Tambu does violently attack someone else, in that case one of her students at a secondary school, rendering the girl deaf. This is the episode with Gertrude. Hands lift Gertrude from the combi's running board. They throw her onto the ground, where she sags with shock. The crowd draws in a preparatory breath. The sight of your beautiful hostel mate fills you with an emptiness that hurts. You do not shrink back as one mind in your head wishes. Instead, you obey the other, push forward. You want to see the shape of pain, to trace out its arteries and veins, to rip out the pattern of its capillaries from the body. The mass of people moves forward. You reach for a stone. It's in your hand. Your arm rises in slow motion. Tambu, she whispers, singling you out. Her mouth is a pit. She is pulling you in. You do not want her to intone you. The second person in this mournable body formally expresses the internal splits within Tambu between the person she is and would like to be, and was and has become. There's a marked split here between Tambu's internal voice of conscience and her desire to surrender to the enjoyment of cruelty. The split maps onto notions of internal conflicts between emotion and reason, or desire and morality. However, in Tambu's case, an internal split is also a manifestation of profound self-alienation. Her sense of self has been progressively undermined by the two intersecting factors of race and gender and their relationship to the tension between tradition and modernity. However, the you extends beyond the representation of competing internal voices. In this passage, Tambu's two minds are referred to, so the narrator remains external to those two minds. You do not shrink back as one mind in your head, as one mind in your head wishes. Instead, you obey the other. An exterior perspective is retained that remains indeterminate. It might be Tambu looking in on herself. If so, this would most convincingly be from a future perspective, as in the first two novels, but refusing the benefit of hindsight by adhering to the present tense. Or it might be a disembodied, authorial narrator, more like a third-person narrative, who, by limiting the focalization to Tambu's perspective, retains real intimacy with her. The narrator uttering the you is never pinned down as being either Tambu or a separate figure, even while Tambu's perspective is maintained throughout. The result is a sustained, converged dual perspective akin to the exchange of linguistic ardors that Pier Paolo Pasolini sees in Free and Direct Speech, where the first and the third person are combined without ultimately being able to designate the origin of the utterance. As a result of this indeterminacy, a constant tension is maintained between distance and intimacy, and between having both Tambu's internal perspective and yet maintaining an external view. The you in this novel thus instantiates the impossibility of separating the individual, the I, from the collective. The individual is conceived of through the direct address from the other, but there is never a response from the I. The novel denies the possibility of an I within material and discursive structures of racial capitalism that promise but intrinsically thwart the notion of the subject that is posited on the white male successful capitalist. Nor can Tambu escape the patriarchal communal bonds of family and homestead. This ambivalence of the second person address, being both external and internalized voice, is the means through which the novel interrogates the complex nature of perpetration and complicity with it, how an individual is enfolded into wider social relations and is both constituted by and constitute relations that cause harm. Finally, the you also, of course, enfolds the reader. As Dangaremga says, the second person denies readers the option of distancing themselves from the protagonist. The text insists on empathy with Tambu, even if we dislike her, and the reader is positioned in a complex interplay of perspectives and voices. The reader is both internal and external to Tambu, and is furthermore addressed directly, while also being potentially aligned with the narrator who utters the you. The reader is consequently suspended in a state of multiple concurrent perspectives that radically refuse a position of purity from which to judge the world. And of course, as either singular or plural, the reader is constructed as both individual and collective. So in this Mournable Body, which is a fantastic novel, sorry, I just have to say how marvelous I think it is, the you generates a rich interpretative openness, and with it an uncomfortable empathy that invites self-reflection. And now I come to my conclusion. What I like about Elizabeth Costello is her irritability at having to defend her writing and her doubt. Costello's irritability and doubt direct us to the value of trading fictions. Fiction doesn't require coherence, closure, or answers. It doesn't have to reconcile paradoxes, ambiguity, or competing perspectives, and its interpretative openness resists the constraints of argument or moral clarity. It thrives on indeterminacy and contingency, and on opening worlds in which emotions, encounters, choices, perspectives can be explored with low stakes, unless readers are punished for reading censored texts. The ethical potential of fiction resides in the interaction of competing voices and discourses, and the interpretative openness, which is also what makes it unsettling when it addresses perpetrators and those complicit with them in less than clear-cut moral terms. So fiction is free in its capacity for play, generating often challenging pleasures. To emphasize the ethical potential it offers through play and pleasure, including the potentially disturbing play of emotions, is to remember its qualitatively distinct contribution to thinking and feeling otherwise, and of imagining different relations. But here again, a word of caution, to quote Elizabeth Costello: she has no faith in art. a heightened awareness of complexity, the challenge it can present to our self-image, doesn't determine a particular moral outcome. Nor, if such awareness were to result in action, would it necessarily be action that all agreed was positive. The pleasures of the text are varied and gratify us emotionally and intellectually, but this gratification isn't always predictable and straightforward. Our enjoyment of a text can be surprising and can vary from reading to reading. Some forms of gratification and excitement may repel us. So the narrator in Sareed's Memory Monster plays a video game for which he's been an expert advisor and which is based on historical atrocities, including trapping slaves in the African jungle and the Holocaust. He plays the game, and as part of the game, he pulls a gold tooth from a corpse and whips a Jew and admits that I couldn't stop. Their game was so wonderfully terrible. When she reads Paul West's novel of 1980, The Very Rich Hours of Count von Stauffenberg, Costello is tormented by the portrayal of the executioner's torture and humiliation of the Stauffenberg plotters. She feels that West has come into contact with absolute evil. The encounter is in one way a blessing because it enables West to do his writerly duty and bring inert matter to life. He has ventured into the labyrinth of Europe's past and faced down the Minotaur and returned to tell his tale, as she says. But it's also a curse because it is obscene to bring what was already an obscenity into the light. She suspects that if literature has the power to make people better, it must also be able to make them worse. Costello cannot resolve this contest and struggles to articulate her view, recognizing that at its root is her emotional experience of reading West's depiction of the hangman's cruelty. She is sickened by the wanton, obscene energy that exceeded his commission, but an energy that in turn excited her to read. Let's not forget that there is great excitement in reading and pleasure in being seduced, whether the means are emotional or intellectual. But the allure of fantasy, the excitation of succumbing to empathy with a horrifying other, is not tantamount to being seduced beyond the frame of fiction. It may be play, including serious intellectual play. Nevertheless, play with seduction and a fascination and empathy with perpetrators may alert one to information about oneself that one would rather not have, as Simon Critchley writes of humour. It challenges us to think about our enjoyment, the thrill of horror, or the pleasure of a moral holiday from inhabiting different personas, including morally repulsive ones. Interpretative openness is not comforting, for it creates an ethical space in which the encounter with the other remains unassimilable. So it's not the pleasures of empathy or the enjoyment of seduction that we should be anxious about, but what we do with the awareness of our gullibility, how we respond to our doubt, and whether in that response we've become complicit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bird, for that wonderful presentation. We will now move on to our discussants and beginning with Professor Weiss. Professor Weiss, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I think that's worked. Is that right? And can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you, and yes, we can hear you.
That's so excellent. Thank you, Stephanie, for that excellent overview of your book, and Iwalewa for your introduction. I'm really delighted to be here to give my responses to the book called Responses to Nazi Perpetration in Fiction. And as we've heard, this raises not only persuasive readings and really important issues, but sometimes very difficult and challenging questions. I've highlighted here the two notions from the subtitle of the book about complicity, which Stephanie spends a long time helpfully defining. It's something that we're all within, but it's hard to see from the outside. It's as if we are either active or passive partners in crime. In other words, in a situation which might seem normal, but which administers harm, which we almost can't see. But as was just highlighted, the positive underside of the notion of complicity is that we're all enfolded together and connected. So there is, to some extent, a grain of hope in that concept. The notion of continuity suggests that traces of the past are still in the present, which I think we're used to thinking about, but these have a very concrete presence, either in terms of individuals or in terms of cultural injustice, which haven't been overruled but continue to affect us. So moving on, I think it's really great that the novel as a form is highlighted and its importance in ethical ways as well, that it's not just for pleasure, even though the pleasure of reading might be part of its importance, for the reasons that we've heard. And I'd like to add to that the novel is full of different voices and positions. It can use comedy, humour and playfulness to bring out vital or distressing material. In any case, it's a site of emphasising the complexity of characters' motives, which in the case of some of these novels are extremely complex. Stephanie just quoted the phrase "a moral holiday," which really attracted my attention to suggest that as readers, sometimes we're drawn by novels to not really know how we're supposed to feel about somebody, that we don't have to follow the right path. We can try out different personas. But in the end, the actions of empathy and also that of doubt are really important in our responses to these texts. Novels can also present very varied historical scenarios and present in various ways, either literally or symbolically, their present-day relevance. So not only hinting at the continuities of the past, but actually making us feel that about the present. Obviously, this book is about Nazi perpetration, and Stephanie highlights the paradox or the contradiction that the Nazi regime was extremely distinctive, and comparing it with other harms and wrongdoings, either before or after, risks losing that sense, but it's also a vital operation to liken it to other things as a warning. What I'm going to talk about mostly is Stephanie's use of popular fiction in her book, which really struck me because it's an area or a genre which is often denigrated or overlooked. But as she argues, and as I agree, it has a really important role to play. Not every critic agrees with this. As you can see, I've put the title of Tanya Gold's essay from last year called "Shameless: Exploiting the Holocaust," where Gold argues that some popular fiction, and she names novels like Sophie's Choice and The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, used for what she calls crass and self-serving ends, the kinds of themes that come up in Holocaust fiction. On the other hand, as you can see in the quotations on the slide, other critics with whom I feel in agreement argue for its importance. Scott McCracken argues that only popular fiction can reach quite so effectively across wide social and cultural divisions and unite readers. As Phyllis Lassner argues, it can also use very familiar emotional registers and narrative forms in order to convey horror. It can also raise, and often does before other kinds of writing, oppositional concerns, as the critic Ken Walpole argued in the 1980s. For him, the kinds of things like women's rights appeared for the very first time in popular fiction. And I think we see that today in relation to the climate crisis and other concerns. Stephanie sums it up herself in the book by saying that warnings from history are made palatable and popular in this form. And it's quite daring that popular fiction, which you might think is there for pleasure, actually raises these important issues of complicity and continuity. Genre fiction is another way of describing popular fiction, which often relies on very recognizable formats like detective fiction, war novels, thrillers, family drama. And Stephanie talks about all of these scenarios in the book. And here's an example of one which she also mentions, Frederick Forsyth's thriller from the late 1970s, The Odessa File. This is fiction, but it raises and focuses on important issues about the aftermath of Nazism, including for people who were growing up in West Germany at the time. However, it is fiction. Stephanie points out that Merle Kruger's novel explicitly relies on this novel and seems to read it as fact. But I feel that Forsyth's influence is quite broad in relation to popular fiction that addresses complicity in the wake of Nazi perpetration, with its interests in archives, mysteries, invented facts, individual violence, and the notion of conspiracy. Moving on to the three examples in the book, Volker Kutscher's detective fiction shows the real potential for the structure of detective fiction to bring out a mystery and a hidden culprit in relation to Nazi perpetration. And you can perhaps see from the illustration there that there's a kind of a Weimar era backdrop with a sort of hard-boiled detective figure in the foreground. And the detective in Kutscher's novels, Rat, works in criminal investigation for a state which is itself criminal. And that is the real concentration and focus of these novels. What happens if a detective who's supposed to be upholding the law is within a lawless regime? And the other crucial aspect is that he gets drawn into that regime without having an ideological commitment to it. And that is an extremely sobering thought in various ways for all of us today, perhaps. The novels inculcate the fight for liberal democracy as a counter to both the failures of the Nazi regime and its perpetration, obviously, but also the failures of Weimar democracy. So detective fiction overall in this scenario has a double meaning about the culprit could be anybody. In an Agatha Christie novel, that's just one of the dramatist's personae. But in these novels, the finger is pointed back at us. Anybody might turn out to be an evildoer. The second example of popular fiction in the book is Merle Kruger's thriller, I think we would call it, Die Experten, The Experts. And the thriller as a form is again really suited to this idea of bringing out hidden patterns and hidden truths, where people who look ordinary on the surface might turn out to be the perpetrator or the complicit person. This novel suggests that former Nazis in the post-war period continued to offer their expertise, which is absolutely true, but it takes that further than was actually the case to suggest a massive conspiracy of that kind. And on the one hand, this is beneficial in warning us against far-right infiltration in government in the present. But on the other hand, as Stephanie argues, the other aspect of this novel, which is that of a family drama, much more low-key than the idea of Nazi networks, is more effective in suggesting that there are individuals who ignore or deny the painful past. And the third example is that of Olga Tokarczuk. Although Tokarczuk is a Nobel Prize winner and a kind of definitely a literary writer, her books are also bestsellers. And in the case of this one, Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead, produce a parody of two kinds of popular fiction, both the revenge narrative and the whodunit. The protagonist here is Janina, who enacts, as we discover ultimately, violent vengeance in her role as a tool for the animals, who she sees as the victims of oppression. As Stephanie argues, this is a difficult case. It brings up the notion of a pervasive complicity because animals are at stake. And as we know, in the human world, they are used and abused very widely, and there's no consensus that that is a crime yet. Yet Janina, who's the person who commits murder, not to give it away, in vengeance for animals, is unsuspected because she's an older woman, both by the reader and by the police within the novel. Yet ultimately, when we realise she is the perpetrator, this alibi of age seems like an excuse, and the novel starts to seem like a typical justification narrative, a self-justification for one's own complicity and ill-doing. So the fictional challenges in each case, just to sum up, for Kutcher's detective novels, it suggests that liberal pluralism is enough, not a more utopian goal. And the series ends before the challenges of the so-called Kristallnacht pogrom of 1938, where anti-Jewish violence really accelerated. So we don't know what the compromised detective would have made of that. For Kruger's thriller, there's an overemphasis on the nature of Nazi networks, and in her novel, the characters all turn away from political activity at the end to other actions. For Tokarczuk, a fantasy of revenge is pleasurable. We might like to read about it, but it's limited. Janina in this novel sets herself up as a one-person judge and jury, like a vigilante. To me, the biggest finding and the most sobering argument of Stephanie's book is that ordinary people are at stake. It's not just our indifference to wrongdoing, but the fact that qualities that look desirable or might be applauded in the present might themselves lead to violence. As mentioned, there's a terrible continuity, not just of people, but of professions, ranging from those who drive trains to universities. However, in the end, because we're talking about fiction, it's readers' awareness of gullibility and their reaction to doubt of these kinds that is really important. And my example here is Michael Faber's novel Under the Skin, where the protagonist is so caught up in her own self-pity that she doesn't take the chance to look at the context of evil doing around her. My concluding questions are, as I think we've gained the impression from Stephanie, how did Elizabeth Costello emerge as what seems like a touchstone for the book? Another question is that of translation. Not all of these novels have been translated into English, which has now become the kind of world lingua franca. What makes the difference between those that are and those that are not? And finally, the cover image for the book is an artwork by Dana Ariel, the photographer, of Hainage Forest, and you can see some more examples here. How did you come to choose that as the kind of the overall image for the book itself? Thank you very much. I will stop sharing. I hope you can gain my enjoyment of the book from what I've said.
Thank you so much, Professor Weiss, and also for the questions that you have posed to Professor Bird. I will have some time to really go over those questions. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Kekesi, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's just really a wonderful opportunity, I think, to talk about Stephanie's work and some of the questions that she raises that I think are so pertinent to our time. So while reading Stephanie's book, I was really intrigued by the way she explores the relevance of the Nazi past in very different social political contexts. And so today I will talk about what I learned from this and what some of my thoughts were. Although the three parts of the book partially overlap in terms of time and region, the main focus of the book really shifts from communist Eastern Europe to West Germany and post-unification Germany and to present-day global capitalism. The first part concentrates on two countries in particular with very different histories of Nazi occupation, Hungary and Yugoslavia. The second part is dedicated to Germany as a successor state of the Third Reich. And the third part is centered on Poland and Israel, again, two countries with very different relationships to the Nazi era. So moving through these geographies of the Nazi as well as the Soviet past, the post-war era and the global present, the chapters cover writers who come from very different generations and with different life stories. If you think of Imre Kertész and Hans Magnus Enzensberger, for instance, they were both born in 1929. But while Kertész was excluded from Hungarian society as Jewish and then deported from Budapest to Auschwitz, Enzensberger grew up in Nuremberg, where he was conscripted to Nazi and military organizations as member of the non-Jewish German majority. Neil Baram, on the other hand, I believe the youngest writer discussed in the book, is my generation. He was born in 1976 in Jerusalem and grew up in a family that belonged to Israel's political elite. In each of these temporal and spatial settings, the book engages with writers who, I quote Stephanie, think about their own social political context, not just about the past, and invite the readers to reflect on their own. Indeed, it is this uncomfortable question of individual responsibility and complicity in various situations of violence, oppression, and exploitation that provides a lens through which the book thinks about disturbing continuities with the Nazi era. So choosing one chapter in each part, Kertész, Enzensberger, and Baram, I will consider these changing contexts in which continuity is experienced and posited by these writers in one way or another. First, Nazism and communist Eastern Europe. Comparing experiences during Nazism and the communist dictatorship is the opening theme in Stephanie's book. Moreover, it returns in each part, making it a persistent line of comparison. For instance, in Enzensberger's book on a German family torn between Nazi and communist commitments in part 2, and then in Nir Baram's novel, Good People, which follows the story of a German man and a Soviet Jewish woman in part 3. As an intellectual tradition, anti-totalitarianism flourished in the Cold War West and compared communism to fascism as a way to legitimize some often conservative vision of democracy and capitalism. Later, it was instrumental in the Western integration, as it was called, of Eastern Europe, and contributed to the spread of victimhood nationalism in the region. That is to say, it comes with a heavy baggage, and Stephanie, in my reading, makes three important corrections. One, she questions the top-down model associated with anti-totalitarianism that fosters victimhood narratives. Two, she considers experiences of continuity without accepting simple equations between fascism and communism. And three, she evokes and engages with anti-totalitarianism without privileging Western democracies in an uncritical way. On the contrary, part 2 and 3 are devoted to critical considerations of these democracies. As for Kertész, the comparison between Nazi and communist totalitarian regimes is underpinned by a skeptical view of modernity itself. The experience of the concentration camp is for him universal in the sense that it epitomizes a stripping away of one's individuality, which turns one's fate into, I quote, a mass fate. For him, this is a specific aspect of dictatorships, I quote, but it also characterizes the modern condition in general, unquote. Mass society, mass movements, mass political parties, mass media and popular culture, the bureaucratization of modern life, etc., are all aspects of modern condition. His brand of anti-totalitarian thinking is rooted in this skeptical reading of modernity, in a conservative anti-modernism almost, which rejects any collective political action as morally already compromised, including, paradoxically, organized resistance to fascism. Stephanie's careful and critical reading of his novels is a welcome and warranted intervention that questions, I quote Stephanie, totalizing schemes in his texts, unquote. Reading Stephanie's commentary on Curtis's late views, I was wondering just how much Curtis's refusal to distance himself from the recent authoritarian regime in Hungary is a result of his conservative skepticism vis-à-vis democracy as a system of government tied to mass society and modernity as a political project. His complicity seems to be therefore deeply rooted in his remarkably consistent oeuvre that, on the other hand, his fiction escapes. Second, for a remarkably inconsistent oeuvre in some ways, Enzensberger started with writing Marxist critique of West German society and ended in a celebration of German aristocracy. Stephanie quotes his poem Defense of the Wolves Against the Lambs from 1957, in which he sarcastically condemns post-war West German society, the lambs of the poem, for their complicity in their own oppression by the wolves, that is, the generals and the profiteers. These are expressions from the poem. Importantly, the poem was written in an era which was notorious for reinstating Nazi elites in the military, the economy, and state administration. In contrast, 50 years later, he celebrated the generals and exculpated, or at least one of them, and exculpated their class and the German army from the charge of committing or condoning Nazi crimes. What I find telling is this story is not just how he switched from condemning silence to embracing it, but also how the controversy around it concentrated on the distortion of the past, rightly so, yet not so much on continued social hierarchies and oppression, economic or otherwise, as did his 1957 poem. I was wondering, is the controversy around him in some ways reflective of our present mode of remembering? That is, finding the right way to remember the past or not finding it, while often ignoring or even obfuscating oppression in the present. Which is precisely why I find Stephanie's third theme so essential for discussing continuities, namely the link between complicity during Nazism and in an era of global capitalism. Crucial for this consideration is her reading of Neil Barham's work, including his novels Good People and World Shadow from 2010 and 2013, respectively, as well as his non-fictional work on Israel-Palestine. While the link between fascism and capitalism is firmly established in the Marxist tradition as opposed to the anti-totalitarian tradition, this is not necessarily where Stephanie's considerations are coming from. What she is interested in is the way Nazism and capitalism can make us complicit in expansionist and exploitative politics, whether we agree with their aims and terms or not. In Good People, one of the main characters, Thomas, is a young German who sees himself as apolitical but becomes complicit in the Nazi expansion and war of annihilation in Eastern Europe. According to the novel, Thomas shifts from working for an American marketing research company to working for the Nazi Foreign Office and uses his research skills to supply the occupation of Eastern Europe with data and planning. The fictional figure is a mixture of Nazi scientists and present-day corporate employees, driven by opportunism rather than ideology, according to the novel. The point is not to posit an equation between fascism and capitalism in any form, but to consider the ways in which the individual is entangled in power relations and contribute to them, willingly or not, in smaller or sometimes in more significant ways. And Stephanie's more recent work on Dangaremga expands on this line of thought even further. The same is true for Stephanie's reading of Bahram's commentary on Israeli politics and his political activism for Palestinian rights. The point is not to use the Holocaust to label present-day instances of violence, but to consider social and individual involvement in and responsibility for oppression, displacement, and dispossession. Finally, when I read Stephanie's characterization of Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who, I quote Stephanie, privileged doubt and argument over feelings and convictions, I thought it was just as true for her own intellectual stance. By reading her work, you can clearly sense her sympathy for writers who are able to self-reflexively question moral, ideological, and emotional certainties, which certainly does not stop her from subjecting them to some scathing criticism, of which the chapter on Enzensberger is a great example. Which is one of the many reasons why reading her is so intellectually engaging and at the same time challenging in all the good ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kakesi. Thank you to all our discussants and our author for this wonderful presentations, very rich perspectives on one book. I am very sure that our audience would have a lot of questions to ask, so we are now inviting questions from the audience. Please use the raise hand function or type your question in the chat. I will introduce you, sorry. And also please introduce yourself briefly before you ask your question. That's what I meant. I apologize for that. Okay. While they're gearing up to ask, these questions, I think we could start with Professor Weiss's last question on translation. And I also just wanted to add something to it and take it in another dimension. I was also thinking, aside from linguistically, what is also lost in that journey, I mean, ethically and politically, when we're talking about translation, I mean, do we also think that maybe the translated perpetrator may travel differently than the original in that sense? So, please, the floor is all yours. And of course, our other discussants, please feel free to also chip in to this.
I think, Sue, in response to your question, I think the Merle Kruger is the only one that isn't translated, isn't it? No, that's not true. I think after about 3 volumes of the German detective story, the English translators obviously didn't have a market for them. So it's quite interesting that they started this very promising series of detective fiction and then have not carried on translating it into English. And my suspicion is that the historical detail and the depth of research that they are based on and that are integrated into the novels is one of the reasons for that they depend on a real fine understanding of the period that would perhaps make it too specific for an English-speaking non-German audience, because of course there are other Nazi detectives, for the one by Philip Kerr is his name, where the level of detail was not as great, and so it was much easier to make a racy and very gripping fiction out of that. As for the Kruger, I think that again, because it intervenes so specifically into contemporary German debates about the past with its different representational modes, the thriller mode and the family drama mode, I think perhaps the sheer the historical specificity of the questions around Nazi continuities in West Germany are not deemed to be interesting for a non-German audience. I should add that certainly the UK publishing industry has a very poor track record in terms of the percentage of non-English books that it translates into English. I think the Americans are much better. So on top of that, we have this sort of publishing institutional reluctance to spend money on translating, which I think relates to the primacy of English and sort of resting on the laurels of thinking that everything can be written in English. As for things being lost in translation, I think translation always changes slightly from the original, but I have taken the view. I mean, I have to admit that even though I know myself well enough to know I will never learn Hungarian because it is singularly difficult as a language, and therefore the fact that I have been able to read Cortés in English is better than not reading him at all. So I do take a sort of vaguely pragmatic and not very purist view on it's better to read things in English than it is not to read them at all. Does that answer your question? Sue, I can't remember. Did you have more? Was there more to the translation question than that?
That was my question. And
That was your question. Yeah.
Yeah. And it does relate a bit to what Iwalewa was saying, that I think you've kind of addressed both of our questions in what you said about Kruger, that somehow the detail is not palatable for an Anglophone audience, or is judged not to be.
Is judged not to be, yeah. It's a great thriller, actually. It works very well, but I think it's too specific. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And then it seems as if we have an extension to that question. So we have a question from Saratu thanking our presenters and then asking what is the best way to introduce this history without causing trauma in schools?
Oh, crikey, what a fantastic question and difficult question. When I see the question relating to schools, I do immediately think about the British system, which teaches up to the age of 18, 16, and now 18. I teach at a university, and I don't personally have the experience of teaching in schools, therefore. We have done, when I say we, I and other colleagues, including Zoltan, and also people who were on the project with us, have worked quite closely with the Holocaust Educational Unit at UCL. And there is a lot of discussion precisely around certainly the presentation of visual material and the context in which visual material should be shown. So thinking about the best way, do you know, I feel I'm really letting you down, Saratu, by not being more clever about giving you this answer because I don't have the experience. But I think the ways in which it is often done is through trying to get children to identify with the lives of those living in the 1930s and how they might have responded, not launching straight into the to the large-scale atrocities. I don't know if anybody else wants to help me out with this answer.
I can't specifically help you out, Stephanie, but I have just read some of a book which is called From Fact to Figures, and it's about fiction written for young readers. So though it doesn't talk specifically about the question of the school teacher in the school classroom, it does talk about the ways that those texts have tried to address that question. And there are a lot more examples of that than you'd think. If it's of interest, I can type the name of the author in to the chat.
mean,
Yeah.
one of the things we've talked about a lot in our discussions about Holocaust education, and indeed education around collective violence and other examples of that, is the ways in which a lot of teaching tends to emphasize specifically the victim position, making it much easier for people learning about history to relate to and identify with the victims, even if they come from, I'm going to loosely call it, the perpetrator community. So for example, we go into Holocaust exhibitions and we all think rightly the horrors that the victims experienced and being murdered, but it is as though we would belong to them, rather than thinking about the majority of people actually being, in the case of Nazism, being on the side of the perpetrators in whatever capacity. And so that identification takes priority over reflecting upon the social processes and individual responsibility that might mean that, oh, actually, I might have, for whatever reason, been a perpetrator, not a victim, and that is perhaps a weakness, if not in some cases a failing, of Holocaust education.
Mm.
But it is very widespread, the reluctance to actually engage directly with perpetrators for reasons that are understandable, because it's very hard then. But we do have a wider discussion at the moment about with the rise of the far right discourses and political parties in Europe, often explicitly with reference to Nazism and anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of racism. What might have been done different educationally, or what role does education have, given that we're seeing a resurgence? We're certainly having those debates now and thinking quite hard about that.
Dr. Sultan, did you want to say something?
Yes, two things come to my mind. Just to add to what Stephanie and Sue mentioned in this context, one is how much, based on our conversations with our colleagues working at the Center for Holocaust Education, how much students are very willing to engage in conversations that center around everyday situations in which ordinary people were confronted with difficult choices, people who belonged to the non-Jewish majority in Nazi Germany. And the best examples I can think of are actually included in that online exhibition that Stephanie mentioned at the beginning. Compromised Identities is the title of this online exhibition that Stephanie and her colleagues at the Center for Collective Violence curated a few years ago, where you can also find interviews and discussions with experts that sort of contextualize and analyze oral history interviews with these ordinary Germans. And then second, our colleague Sandra Lipner recently worked with school children, bringing in archival documents and how to interpret historical documents is also something that I think she thought was really productive in the classroom in secondary school education.
Thank you so much for the wonderful responses to the questions. Do we have any further questions from the audience? Please don't forget to type in your questions, or just use the raise hand function. Okay. I think another thing I wanted to throw a question to all three of you, because I think another thing that is going on here is a bit of interdisciplinarity, a lot of interdisciplinarity actually. And I was just wondering, as experts in your respective fields, and the core argument that fiction has a structural openness, for instance, and that is what makes it important, this kind of narratives that we're trying to spotlight. But then I was wondering, do you still think that the novel's structural flexibility allows um for like the novel is structurally flexible, or do you think there are things that it is formally incapable of doing that maybe you could do better with history or visual culture or documentary? And I'm thinking of this question, with Dr. Zoltan in mind, especially because you come from a cultural theoretical lens, and I was wondering, you're looking at memory, and I'm just wondering how you feel about the structural openness of fiction, and of course to Stephanie and Sue as well.
So I think having a background in literature, but working most recently mostly with oral history interviews and archives, I can definitely see some of the similarities that fictional and non-fictional documents or genres or products, if you will, raise. But I think that Stephanie's word of caution is very warranted here. The difference between fiction and non-fiction, I think, does matter. But reading from her book, from this perspective, I still think that some of her considerations are very productive when applied in this context of researching documents that are non-fictional. Oral history as a narrative, for example, questions of, for example, empathy with a voice there and with someone who may have um, acted in ways or may have held views that we disagree with. That question of identification and empathy, I think, is structurally similar to what Stephanie is looking at when analyzing novels. So I'm very interested in seeing this similarity, while at the same time I take Stephanie's caution um, or remarks on the differences very seriously.
That's a really interesting question that you pose, the limitations of the novel form in relation to others. And I don't think that I have, well, the way where it's perhaps been most extensively articulated in relation to post-Holocaust literature is the notion, I mean, Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, said any novel about the camps is not a novel. That idea that as soon as you try to fictionalize something, it is somehow offending against the fundamental trauma and horror and scale of horror of what happened. So that idea that as soon as you try to tell stories of things, you are necessarily somehow belittling or trivializing what occurred. That relates to the whole discussion of Holocaust kitsch and in a way Sue has addressed that via the form of popular culture or popular fiction, which is fascinating. And also I've touched on that in relation to, do we place value on pleasure, enjoyment, and what it means to discover our own pleasures in reading and what that might mirror back to us. But it's interesting that you pose the question the way you do, because I've most obviously come across that sort of questioning about the limitations of the novel as form in relation to the climate disaster and the fact that climate, theorists who are thinking about how to respond to the climate crisis in cultural representations of what any sort point to the way that the history of the novel is very much one that emphasizes individuality, contained lives, even if they're epics. They focus on largely on individuals in some way, and are also very interested in interiority and the internal workings and emotions and exploring those in whatever way, whereas the climate crisis and the nature of the time and the geological scale and all the scale of the whole thing is so massive that the novel simply can't encompass that in any way. And how does it? It's an interest. That's a really thought-provoking question, whether that also somehow relates to questions of collective violence and the scale of violence. I think perhaps sort of reverse engineering from questions about the climate crisis to how that might relate to large-scale violence is a very interesting one. I've always thought that the novel can pretty much do whatever it wants, but that there are theorists who do not think that.
Okay, we have a question from Mary Holbrook. Mary, can you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Those were wonderful talks. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely super presentations. I want to just pick up on that question and just go on playing with it, the novel and history. Speaking as a historian who loves reading novels, I'm always very jealous of fiction writers and novelists because they can portray internalities and subjectivities and the minutiae of interpersonal relations on a small scale so that you can get really absorbed in a novel. Whereas when you're writing history books, you have to portray very large developments. And I think Zoltan intimated this or touched on it. You have to try and understand from people's materials, ego documents of one sort or another. In the case that Zoltan was talking about, many oral history testimonies, you have to sort of sort out how they're narrating what they've experienced and how you interpret that. But you can't, when you're writing, somehow portray it with the immediacy and the immersion effect that good novelists can manage to do. So I'm always back and forth between the jealousy of the portrayal of internalities and subjectivities and intimate relations and the awareness that historians have to portray wide events, huge swathes of stuff and millions of people. And what the question that really interests me, and I wonder, I doubt that anyone on the panel, brilliant though the three of you all are, I doubt that you can give an answer that will work. But I just wonder if there's any way that historians could learn from novels to write better history or more interesting history or more compelling history that isn't limited to individual cases and individual iconic figures and focus on the few familiar figures, but does actually encompass the villages of Volhynia, Ukraine, and so on, as well as the hiding holes in Amsterdam of well-known diary writers. It's just really, really complex. And I don't know if reading novels can help us to think of better ways of writing history. It's a question which really perplexes me.
That's a really interesting question, Mary. And just extremely briefly, I was reading somebody arguing that micro histories of the exact kind that you mentioned actually use novelistic strategies to some extent. So does that suggest there is a coming together in some historical kinds of writing of exactly what you've asked for, the Volhynia case, for example?
I'm slightly concerned, Mary, that you want to become like a novelist in a way. I know you don't, because it seems to me that the value of history is to analyze and not just recreate the interiority or the emotions or the sort of reflections of not so much the reflections unless there's a historical trace and there is evidence for them, but the whole point about fiction is that it can make that move into supposition, and history becomes very bad history when it does so. So I would have thought that was one of the strengths of history, that it is trying to understand causality, and it is up to a point in the service, working in the service of an argument in the way that fiction doesn't need to. So I would I would think that history becomes possibly poor history if it goes too far in the way of the novel. I may be a bit old-fashioned in holding this view. I know that, you know, inventing archives is now a thing. I'm slightly wary of that idea in this age of fake news, but yeah.
Could I briefly answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I wasn't suggesting we should get away from analysis and causality and argument and involvement in argument. I'm just thinking a bit going back to the previous question about how young people can become interested in this and can understand it. It follows on a bit from that. I think the problem with a lot of historical texts is that they depart so far from people's experiences and voices that they become unreadable except among the few academic specialists in the field who are interested in where the argument is being taken and what the evidence suggests. And you can almost forget that the evidence, the argument relates to real people and real experiences. And I was just trying to think of ways that one could combine the two approaches rather than melt history into novel writing, but just bring something in from what we can learn from novels into history writing in some way without losing what you rightly point out as the analytic and argumentative functions and purposes of history writing.
Perhaps you could have a parallel text, Mary. On the one side, you have a sort of historical novel, and on the other side, you have the historian. And you present it clearly as you would in a parallel text with translation and see what comes out of it. That would be quite a radical new thing to do.
I'm sorry, for a second, I was also lost in the question and trying to just think of ways, and I completely forgot that I was here, so I apologize for that. Okay, our time is up, and this has been a wonderful presentation, and it's been eye-opening. On behalf of WADJ Center, I want to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Bird for a book that insists that we sit with difficulty rather than look away. Thank you so much to Professor Weiss, to Dr. Kekesi. Thank you for responses that, that really just expanded this conversation. And also thank you to our audience and everyone for, your engagement and your questions. Thank you so much. If there are no further questions, I will now close the event. It was so wonderful to meet everyone. Thank you.
Thank you again, Iwalewa. Thank you. And thank you for
Thank you so
stepping in
much.
at the last minute. Thanks.
No,
Yes,
thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Right.